whole, and this is being recorded for those who couldn't be with us today. Wonderful. So welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have you here on this webinar entitled Inclusion of People with Disabilities in Clinical Research, the Accessibility by Design, ABD, in Clinical Research Toolkit. It's wonderful to see everyone here, and I want to say that this is it in presentation mode for everyone else? I don't see. Thank you very much. My name is Barbara Beerer. I am the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center. I'm joined today by William DeCorme-Putsky, the acting program director of MRCT and a presenter on the ABD, the Accessibility by Design Toolkit. A warm welcome to Cecile Gonzalez-Caramele, who will join us as well for her comments later on today. I am sorry to say that Duke could not be here with us today due to an emergency. If you could go to the second slide, and we send him our very best wishes. He did send us some thoughts, and we'll share them when we start the discussion. Many thanks to both Cecile and Duke for their contributions to the toolkit and to this webinar. And I have to say to many, many other people who have contributed to the toolkit as well. I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, closed captioning is being enabled, but and feel free to click on the CC live transcript box to say show captions, but please make sure to keep the captions in English. It turns out that there is some glitch in this program, at least it's set up here, that if anybody changes the language to another language, it changes it for all. So you'll see a few reminders if anybody does that, but so please do keep it on English. Feel free to post commentary in the chat, but please submit questions in the Q&A, all of which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Having a panel discussion later in the webinar, and it's much easier for us to find the questions that you'd like answered in the Q&A session, and we can also answer them directly if necessary. There will be a brief survey when you log out of the webinar. It's 3 questions. It'll take a minute or 2 to finish. And we really welcome your feedback on this webinar so that we can continue to provide the kind of content that would be helpful to you all. Could I have the next slide, please? The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions from foundations and grants, and you can see who they are on our website. And all of us are speaking for ourselves and don't represent the positions or policies of the FDA, NIH, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard University, or any other affiliated organization or entity. We have no personal conflicts of interest with this presentation and look forward to giving it. Could I have the next slide, please? I want to give just a minute of background to the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center for those that are not familiar. It is a research and policy center at both the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard that works on the integrity, safety, and rigor of international global clinical trials. And we do that by engaging diverse stakeholders, that's pharma, academia, patient advocates, nonprofit organizations, regulators, to help us define the emerging and unsolved issues in international clinical trials, and then to create actionable and practical solutions based on ethical foundations and principles. We believe that having everyone around the table really helps to frame an approach that will be more acceptable to everyone. And that's how this work has been done. Could I have the next slide, please? This work builds on a history of work we've been doing over the last probably 8 years now on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we're not going to review that work, but I just do want to refer you to the website where you will find a significant, not only the document that we produced, but tools, resources, and practical guidance for populations other than those with people with disabilities. So I do want to alert everyone that that is there, and we are continuously updating the work that we do there and the resources we provide. Could I have the next slide, please? So when we think about the MRCT Center trial or the trial process and think about addressing inclusivity, one really needs to start with making sure that everyone has access to and learns about the trial, regardless of where they live, and has the opportunity to be considered for eligibility for the trial, and then to really be decide for themselves whether they wish to be considered for the trial and accept the trial. That trial then has to be accessible to the population, to the individuals, and one has to be very conscious of the burden and operational considerations of participation, all of which we will discuss today. Of course, we're very conscious about the trial costs and making sure that people are not burdened financially as well as in other ways, and providing accommodations throughout the clinical trial. And then we believe that all studies should end with communicating the results of the trial, and insofar as possible, individual results of the trial to the participants. When we think about these participants, across a range of dimensions of diversity and intersectionality, and that is race and ethnicity, sex and gender, age, including the very young and the elderly at all stages of the age group, pregnancy and lactating, women and people, disability or impairment, which we're going to focus on today, the social determinants of health, which are incredibly important for thinking through eligibility as well as access to the trials, comorbidities, concomitant medications, location, is somebody in a rural population or an urban or suburban, and then the genetics of participation. So each of these contribute to diverse participation in clinical trial, and only with inclusiveness will we really understand safety and benefit and risks to the population at large. Next slide. So we have done a significant amount of work on populations and people with disabilities, and just want to refer you to a project that we did that Lily Ann led on excluding people with disabilities in the eligibility criteria. many of which lacked clarity or justification, or were so incredibly diffuse in their statement that you could exclude many participants who would otherwise be eligible. With that, next slide. And we've done significant work on inclusion of people with who would benefit from a supported decision-making opportunity, being accompanied in their decision or making their decision with a supporter, something that Willianne will talk about as well. Believing that instead of having a surrogate decision-making, a decision maker, we should always promote autonomy for the individual themselves. With that, Willianne, let me introduce you to give us an introduction to the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So thank you so much, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone for being here today, whether it's morning, evening for you, wherever you are in the world. I'm Willianne DeCormier-Plasky. I am the acting program director at the MRCT Center, focusing primarily in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have brown hair, brown eyes, and I wear glasses. And today I'm wearing a flowered shirt. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the Accessibility by Design and Clinical Research Toolkit. And I wanted to start by giving a bit of a background. So there are over 1 billion people in the world and 240 million children that have a disability. In the United States, it's about 1 in 4 adults in the population that have a disability, and they make up the largest minority group in the United States. However, people with disabilities are often excluded from clinical trials. As Barbara showed in an earlier slide, we did a study on eligibility criteria, which showed extensively the ways in which the language can affect exclusion of people with disabilities in study protocols. Product safety and efficacy and the generalizability of study results are dependent upon the inclusion of populations who will use the product. So hence why we have these efforts in diversity and inclusion, so that you make sure that the products are safe and effective for the people who will be using them. Also, there's a lot of regulatory kind of impetus to be making sure that you're working in inclusion. So recently, the FDA is now requiring the submission of diversity action plans for all phase 3 and later trials. The guidance for these action plans are currently focused on race and ethnicity. However, the guidance requests that study teams, sites, and sponsors consider factors beyond race and ethnicity, such as the inclusion of people with disabilities. Also, there is a proposed Rule 1557 to the Affordable Care Act, which prohibits discrimination and access to healthcare for people with disabilities. There are also many other guidance and laws, a lot of which we list in the toolkit. So you'll see those throughout the toolkit when we get into it. Next slide, please. So why this toolkit? As we've been working over the last 1.5 years we started out with a small working group that we've been working with colleagues from Harvard, Columbia, University of Utah Law School, and others. As we were working on sort of some of the two-pronged approach with the supported decision-making, but also kind of in other aspects of disability, we were trying to understand sort of the how of, how do we really foster better inclusion? So we started looking around for if there was a toolkit available. We saw a couple that were in other fields, such as education, or in the health field, but not specifically for clinical research, such as UNICEF has a new toolkit on disability in humanitarian settings. We also saw some resources that were very specific, such as web guidelines, but not really a compilation of these resources. that could be used by sponsors, contract research organizations, IRBs, investigators, kind of everyone in this clinical research ecosphere. So we wanted to create kind of a one-stop shop for accessibility resources to use in the planning, conduct, and communication of clinical research. So what we created, which we'll be showing you shortly, is currently in a PDF format, but we do hope to bring this to more of a web version eventually, so that it's a bit more accessible. So the process for developing the toolkit, over the last 6 to 9 months, we have conducted 2 rounds of review with over 20 disability rights leaders, researchers, nurses, people with disabilities, family caregivers, and allies. Cecile is among them. And we really give our thanks to everyone who's been involved in this process and has shared their insights and expertise. Next slide, please. So to give you just a little bit more information to kind of preface before I show you what's in the toolkit, I wanted to give you a little bit more kind of broad overview. So the toolkit is the accessibility by design, which we call AbD, is focused on clinical research. However, many of the tools are also applicable to clinical care. So for those of you who are on this call who are more involved in clinical care, perhaps this is also probably quite useful for you, we hope. It's applicable for supporting the inclusion of people with different disabilities, whether it's a mobility disability, communication, cognitive impairment. We tried to make it relevant to people who have all different kinds of disabilities. However, one caveat is that we did not specifically address inclusion of people who lack decisional capacity. There's a lot of legal and other kind of issues that are involved with people who lack decisional capacity, such as the use of a legally authorized representative. And we felt that's better addressed in separate resources. So we kind of go from the point in the toolkit of capacity assessment and working with people who have decisional capacity, even if that capacity is impaired, so long as they do not lack completely decisional capacity. We do not include specifications for pediatric participants. They're generally the same as they are here, but again, this is another kind of specialized population. I do want to alert you, though, that we have a project within the MRCT Center on pediatric research that just recently released a new toolkit. So Juliet will be posting that to the chat for your reference. We also do not include specification for disability data collection standards. We mentioned that, data collection is very important, and we give reference to materials for data collection standards, which are kind of in different places. The challenge is that there's no standards yet that are kind of agreed to within the clinical research community. So we kind of direct you to the most updated materials that are kind of ongoing in that dialogue throughout the healthcare space. We also don't address the different steps necessary for physicians to decide when and how to do a capacity assessment. However, we do link to materials for that. There's one specifically I wanted to point out, which is the UK National Institute for Healthcare Research, has an include capacity to consent framework, which Juliet will put in the chat and is also in the toolkit. And finally, always a challenge defining reasonable accommodations. And we think that this is kind of a point to look to more in the future to define, but when different sites have different levels of resources, it's kind of a question of what reasonable accommodations means in practice. So we don't fully get into that into the toolkit. Next slide, please. So what is in the toolkit? So we break the toolkit into 5 different themes. We have preparing for accessibility by design. These are general considerations that are applicable across all work in accessibility. We have communication accessibility, physical accessibility, a section on innovating accessibility by design, which is we call newer strategies for inclusion, but are really often strategies that are utilized or called for within the disability community, but which aren't necessarily implemented yet into clinical research policy. And in that section, we use the example of supported decision-making. And then upholding ABD, we kind of come back full circle to accountability and advocacy. And that's where you'll see some of these points that I made in one of the previous slides. We have a section with some advocacy points. Next slide, please. So what does this look like within each theme? So within each theme, and I'm going to explain a little bit what's on the slide for those that might not be able to see. It's a little bit small print, and I apologize for that. So we have within each theme, we have key points and we have tools. For the key points, I'm showing you at the right a snapshot of the communication accessibility section. And these are two of the 5 key point groupings within there. So we have on the left-hand side, we have point 1, which is be respectful and an icon. And point 2, format communication materials for inclusive reading and mental processing. We also have an icon there. On the right-hand side, we have key points within each of these groupings, which we code by what we call skill level or feasibility. So we were asked by reviewers to kind of group these according to a maturity model or kind of level of skill. And we did our best with that. We understand that all of these are very important, but we kind of wanted to give people some starting points. So we put these in skill levels of green circle, blue square, and black diamond, so that you have kind of a color and a shape. So green circle is supposed to be something easy that kind of anybody can do without any specific training. Blue square is anything where you may need some kind of specialized advice, such as legal advice or working with a tech person. And black diamond is something that might require more resources or more detailed skills, such as, really getting deep into the web design. So just to show you a couple examples of what's on the screen. So in green, under be respectful, one of the things that we say is to ask, don't assume, ask the participant and practice active listening. For example, also treat physical aids as an individual's personal space. In blue, we have provide a quiet and relaxing environment, so avoiding cell phones and computers and ambient office noise. And I don't have on this slide, but at the bottom actually of number 2, we have something that's on web design specifically on creating things like mega menus that really allow people to navigate more easily. One more thing to note on this slide is that anything, any number there, any reference that's blue and underlined is a hyperlink. So that is where there's a tool that you can go directly to that tool to find what you need. So for example, if you're wanting to do something like color contrast, which I have been learning a lot lately as I've been putting these together, you can go right to that tool, you enter in your colors, and it'll tell you if it's sufficiently contrasted. So we have these direct links, and then anything that's not underlined in blue is just a reference for published literature. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a couple samples of different kinds of tools that are in the toolkit. So one of them is an example that you see at the right, where we kind of compare something that may be problematic or challenging with examples of how you could do preferred language or a preferred method. So this refers back to the slide on eligibility criteria. We have some examples that we drew from our previous study of problematic eligibility criteria on the left, and some preferred language on the right, and kind of really pushing those who write protocols to really think about things like the justification and specification. So any justification for exclusion should be specified, and it should be justified according to scientific, safety, or ethical reasons. Next slide, please. So this is another example of a different kind of tool that we have in the toolkit. This is kind of a companion tool. So we have a tool that prefaces this, that is something that drew from that original diversity, equity, and inclusion toolkit, which was a site assessment flowchart, basically to kind of help people work through thinking about what you need to do for feasibility and site assessment. And one of the boxes in that tool kind of alerts people to look at specific accessibility of how this might be for kind of populations overall. So then we kind of highlight that and then direct people to this tool, which helps people to think through mapping of different kinds of challenges that people may face who have disabilities in getting to a site, navigating within a site, all the different places within a site, from the front door to the office, to getting labs and all the other things that you may need to get, to getting home. And what you see on the screen are just some examples. It's not exhaustive. And we advocate in the toolkit to work closely with people with disabilities to be able to more appropriately kind of map this out. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's another example of a different kind of tool that we have in there. We have two different handouts, or what you could call briefers. The first one, which is not on this slide, is directly for people with disabilities to inform them about kind of, what a trial is, but also how to request accommodations, what they can request in sort of the trial process. This one that you see on the screen is the second page of a briefer for supporters who have been asked by a person with a disability to act as a supporter in supported decision-making. So the first page of this actually has kind of information about what a supporter is, what a supporter might be able to do. And then this page has kind of goes through where there might be decision points in the trial that a person may need assistance with, and some key questions that the supporter may want to ask the research team. We also have information in the toolkit, which is on is for research teams to better understand the different state laws that are involved with supported decision-making, because unfortunately in the US, they're kind of a patchwork all over the place. So we give some guidance on the similarities and differences in the state laws and questions to ask of participants when you're working with them in supported decision-making. Next slide, please. So just wanted to kind of highlight that the Accessibility by Design Toolkit is now posted as of last night on the MRCT website. So you can go here to the website to download the toolkit. This is, a first iteration of the toolkit, and we very much welcome your feedback, your comments. Feel free to be as critical as need be, whether it's the language we used or, the tools. And also you're welcome to suggest any gaps that you see where you think that there could be a tool or an adaptation to a tool in there that could be of service to you and to the people that you work with. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand it off to Barbara and to Cecile to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willianne, both for the presentation and more importantly, for all the work, and your collaborators for all the work of putting this together. To the audience, do put your questions in the Q&A as you have them, because we'll take them in order at that time. So I'm delighted to introduce the discussion today. Unfortunately, Duke Morrow couldn't be with us, as I mentioned, but he asked us to share his biography and some thoughts because he couldn't be here. Duke is a second career retired clergy after working in a special machine tool field for 30+ years. He became a clergyman. He served congregations in inner city Detroit and above the Arctic Circle. He's been a member of the University of Michigan's IRBs, both the medical and human social behavioral research IRBs, for the last 8 years. And it presently serves on the NIH All of Us research program IRB, the Ann Arbor VA IRB, and other IRBs as a community member and a prisoner advocate. He sent us some comments as he was unfortunately unable to be here. And what he said is, the most important thing I have to share is that you cannot understand what being handicapped is until you have lived it yourself. I grew up in a home where my father was a polio victim and depended on crutches or wheelchair for mobility. I believed I knew what being handicapped was like until I became so and found out I had no idea. Never assume you know. Any researcher must put aside any knowledge they have learned academically and accept the lived experience of the participants. And I really appreciate that sentiment and for his agreeing to let us share that with the audience. I'm delighted to welcome Cecile Gonzalez Caramele, a senior director in the Diversity in Clinical Trials group at Eli Lilly and Company. She's spent over 3 decades at Lilly in roles spanning from discovery research to late phase drug development. And her most recent focus has been on improving accessibility of clinical trials to all, including underrepresented populations. As a patient advocate, she incorporates personal experience to ensure patient participants continue to be considered from early in the planning center process through the implementation of clinical trials. So let me welcome you, Cecile. I ask you to, spend a few minutes, as long as you like, well, not as long as you like, but a few minutes telling us about yourself and how you got involved in inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, Barbara and William, for being able to share some of my perspectives and experiences here with the group. As Barbara mentioned, I've spent quite a bit of my career here at Lilly. I'm a chemist by degree, and I have yet to do chemistry as a career. And I've had the privilege of having been in a number of different roles, spanning all the way from discovery research into clinical design and implementation. And in addition to that, I also had the privilege of participating and being a part of our new product planning organization, which in essence is more of our customer facing organization, where we get to hear the voice of that customer directly, whether that is the patient or the provider, and better understand what are the needs for those individuals relative to the disease state that they're kind of experiencing. I am also a native of San Juan, Puerto Rico, so I am Latina, even though this doesn't necessarily look it for you. And so I'm very passionate about ensuring that we are thinking about our underrepresented patient populations within our clinical research and again through drug development. I am a board member of our employee resource group called HOLA, which is for our Latino employees, and I am also kind of specifically why I'm very passionate about this topic is because I am the mother and caregiver of a cancer survivor. My daughter, at the age of 6, upon her graduation from kindergarten, was diagnosed with a stage 3 kidney cancer. We came to find out that it was fortunately Wilms and not something else. And through her journey, we experienced being a family that was going through a clinical trial. She was a participant in a clinical trial, not only for her treatment, but also a biomarker study where samples were collected and hopefully, something was done with them that was meaningful to help advance the science. And many of the elements that William described on at least having access and awareness to clinical trials. I had the privilege of having worked in clinical trials. I understood what that looked like for adult patients, but I never imagined what that would look like for pediatrics. In addition to that, just understanding what is that trial burden. When you look at the schedule of activities and you consider what does that visit look like for that patient, where does that patient need to go, and what are the burden associated with not just for the patient but also for the caregiver, the amount of time that you're spending at that location, and supporting that individual through their journey, whether that's at the clinic or at home, especially as they experience some potential side effects relative to their treatment. We focus on bringing that study closer to the patient. So throughout this experience, it's really brought to light the fact that we need to be, as Bruce mentioned, it's very difficult to understand at times what that means until you've actually lived it and experienced it. And so I wouldn't necessarily want anyone to experience the journey that we've been on, because it's been a difficult one for our entire family. But I do feel like there is a component of being able to connect and relate to someone who's had that experience, whether that experience has been through not being offered clinical trial as a part of their care continuum, whether there's lack of education on what it means to be a part of a clinical trial, whether that eligibility criteria needs to be assessed, and really with the lens of how do you become more inclusive in participants in clinical trials. And then how do you work closely with patients in order to bring that voice of the patient into the study designs and kind of weave that in as you consider what is that life and day like for that patient, that caregiver, that family. So I'm very passionate about this topic. I am happy to say my daughter will turn 23 this year. She's a beautiful college student who's at Indiana University studying psychology, and I think her passion is going to be somewhat related to the work that we're currently doing here as well on equity. I think she's finding kind of her path and her passion relative to health equity and just ensuring that the voice of individuals who've had that life experience or maybe haven't, but have been engaged with individuals relative to that journey, that their voices are heard. So we did, as a part of our scope of work and what we're doing here within the diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, we did launch a workshop in October of last year where we engaged our employee resource group for employees with disabilities, because we wanted to really understand, again, what is that lived experience? You can't necessarily truly understand that until you actually see it. And so we held a 10-day workshop where we brought in a number of leaders. We brought in a number of individuals from our Enable Employee Resource Group, and we walked through, what does that journey look like? What are some of the barriers? And we assessed protocols with the lens of what are some of those opportunities that we can have for not just educating about clinical trials, but also making it more accessible for patients to be able to participate. So some of those learnings and insights, as William was kind of walking through and I was copiously taking some notes, we've actually woven into and given that feedback into the toolkit. So hopefully you'll see some of our inputs as a part of that. I would be remiss if I didn't ensure that I acknowledge the fact of our employee resource group, 2 team members who were instrumental in that workshop, Matt Dwyer and Darren Rowan, who are part of our Enable resource group and have been instrumental and phenomenal in providing their experience and their journey. Barbara, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I had to do it once. It was really a terrific sort of, moment in the life of both a advocate, a professional, and a mother. And thank you so much for sharing that experience. I think you saw the hearts and support that were floating up your way, and we send it.
Thank you.
So let me just suggest again that anybody who has questions or thoughts to please put in the Q&A if you want to share what you find is the greatest challenges you've had in terms of working to include people with disabilities, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A and we'll take that on. But I've been interested, William, since you've had so many people review this and contribute to it. What has been sort of the feedback, and what do people find either most helpful or most difficult to achieve? If you could just comment on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, and we've been so grateful for all of, as I said, for all of the feedback that we've gotten. I think that, as I mentioned before, one of the things was sort of this, where do we start? I think that comes up kind of a lot because sometimes it can seem overwhelming or like there's a lot of cost involved, but really once you get started and kind of get these things under your belt, like things like, just regularly using alt text and, in your PowerPoints and regularly doing color contrast, they become much easier and kind of part of the routine. So that's sort of one of the things I think that was important coming up. A couple of other things, just to say, sort of reflecting on just my personal experience with this going forward. So I also have a daughter with disabilities, one of which is a visual disability, and she can't see things that have any kind of flashing lights or rotating or anything like that. And so I'm constantly, we have information about that in the toolkit, but I'm constantly thinking about, now that I see it, always, I kind of, it's almost intuitive now that we don't really have to think about it. And also just doing the research on this, how many of the things that we use in our daily lives were created by and with people with disabilities, things like just typing, text messaging, all these different kinds of things. I also live with severe asthma, and there's days when I can't speak, and I'm so grateful for text messaging. But a couple other things just to mention that have come up. One thing is, when we've been talking about, one of the things that's going on recently in clinical research is decentralization of trials. And, there's a big push for more efficient, decentralized trials, but questions on how that impacts people from different underrepresented populations and people with disabilities. So, not only how do you make things accessible at your site that people are coming to visit, but how do you make them accessible in a decentralized format, especially when people may have different intersecting identities. So for example, if you have an app or a portal, we've received commentary, you need to make sure that that app or portal, not only is the first page of that app accessible, but every page within that is accessible, and not just in English, in Spanish. If you're going to have, just make sure that you have space, that you may have longer text strings in Spanish. So if you have a text box or something that's in English, you need to make sure there's extra space when it's translated in Spanish. It's not completely difficult to see for someone who speaks Spanish or who has a disability. And also that there's help desks available, not just for the research itself, but to access that tech, that help desk is accessible. So these different kinds of points have been coming in kind of from across the spectrum. We've had people who are nurses who responded back, well, you really need to think about now in decentralized trials, when you're giving information to participants, at the site, what do they also have to do at home? Because a lot of this is now being managed at home with decentralized trials. So what kind of, steps are those participants and any family caregivers going to need to be able to do this at home? And even things as far as like opening bottles, what is that if it's not going to be, if you're not going to be doing it at the site, how are you doing it at home? Sorry, is there background noise, Barbara? For me?
There is some background noise, so I don't know where that's coming from.
I'm not sure. I'll try and speak a little bit louder. It's very quiet for me. And just one last thing to put, I think we'll put in the chat. One of the questions that we get a lot is on working with people who have cognitive and intellectual disabilities, particularly as researchers, as part of the research team. I wanted to point out that we tried to put some resources in the toolkit, but also one of the groups we've been in touch with is at Vanderbilt University. they've been doing a big project. I have it written down here called the ASSERT project, ASSERT. All stakeholders engage in research together. And Juliet can put that in the chat, but there's a lot of kind of ongoing work in this area, and I find it really exciting. So those are just a kind of couple of points.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of the questions in the chat, Cecile, is how were you able to get these considerations embedded in the work of your company? And then how did you communicate that to the site as critical? So let's start there. And because everybody has a lot to do and a lot to focus on. And this is sort of like at the end, oh yeah, we got to worry about this.
Well, and I think you just kind of articulated where we need to start, right? We can't think about this as something that it's at the end of that conversation. It needs to be something that we start the conversation. We start the strategy around what do we need to ensure that we are being as inclusive as possible within our clinical trials. I think if teams wait until they're already in execution and enrolling the study, they find themselves in a position where they have to figure out how to pivot in order to make it more accessible. And that's exactly what we're trying to get away from. We need to make sure that we're building diversity in by design and in design. And if we do that effectively, then as we think about the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the schedule of activities, the decentralized capabilities that could make it less burdensome for patients to participate, all of those elements, the education, the translations, all of those pieces will come together only if we start by thinking about diversity by design and in design. So those are the things that we are beginning to surface for teams as where it's important to engage us in that journey and in that conversation, because if you bring us in at the end, we're missing out on a huge opportunity. And it also makes it less feasible for us to be able to be as inclusive as possible and meet the needs, not just of the FDA, but just, it's the right thing to do to ensure that we're generating medicines to meet the needs of all patients. So those conversations have evolved over time. We have gotten quite a bit of buy-in from our senior leaders, and it's part of the expectation that we are looking at this with that lens and ensuring that we are as inclusive as possible. So I have the privilege of working for a company that takes that seriously, not just from the workforce perspective, because it all starts there as well in the internal culture, but then how does that translate into the work that we do and the patients that we serve?
Thank you. One of the things we always hear is it costs so much to provide for, inclusion of people with disabilities and others where they have some sort of special needs. Do you find that that's true? And does Lilly as one model company actually provide additional resources for accommodation?
So that's a great question. I am not seeing that as holding true, right? I think, again, if you build it in from the beginning, it's a lot easier to better understand what is needed, whether it be from an accommodations perspective, translations, or anything else that the family may need. We do leverage a number of vendors that provide support, and we build it into our budgets for transportation and lodging and meals. So that's kind of the basic at a minimum that we provide. Now, obviously, we don't necessarily have control of what do the facilities look like and whether or not they're accessible to our patients. And so we have to rely on the assessment of the sites to ensure that they provide those services to their patients that they serve as well. But this is it's been it's been a great experience as far as really understanding all of the things that we are doing internally to make it more accessible for patients and make it less burdensome for them as well.
And have you been getting also site feedback on how this is going and sort of what the site experience is? Because it's always harder in, you know, real time to sort of anticipate the needs. So that's one question. Let me ask two others, then you can decide whether to respond or not. The other thing that I've been thinking about is, how do you really engage people with disabilities more in the planning and the execution? That's and are there any specific provisions for informed consent that you want us to think about? So I can keep peppering with questions, but let me stop for a second and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, no, excellent. So from a site feedback perspective, I just returned from the Society of Clinical Research Sites conference about a month ago, and very clearly what we're hearing from sites is that they, you know, through the course of the pandemic, they obviously lost a lot of resources, and so they're turning to sponsors to see how we can best support them in being able to see participants and being able to enroll participants within clinical trials. So that's an area that we're exploring of, you know, how best can we support sites when they find themselves in a position where they don't necessarily have the adequate resources in order to be able to support their patients and their participants. So that's one piece. The second piece around that particular topic is, we've also heard that in order to engage more diverse participants, there needs to be a community outreach, right? There's only so much that we can do internally, and those sites know their communities, they know their patients, they understand their geographies. And so what can we do from a sponsor perspective to engage with communities, to enable the sites to be able to engage with their communities and bring that voice of the patient more into what we're doing. So that's another point of learning that we're kind of pulling that through and trying to see how we can make that more actionable at the moment. Regarding informed consent, I can tell you that having gone through the experience of the informed consent document, it is a very lengthy and comprehensive document. I can definitely appreciate the fact that why it needs to be as comprehensive as it is, but I'm also asking our internal folks, is there something that we can do? Is there a different format that we can use in order to communicate what it is that the patient is really leaning into and signing up for, as opposed to having to read, you know, 20 plus pages of something that, you know, by the time you get to page 2, your eyes have glossed over, and if you're in the unfortunate position of you know, it being more of a life-threatening illness, you don't have there's not a lot of time or brain power to spend on really digesting and understanding 26 pages of an informed consent. So that's another area where we're looking to streamline and make it much more patient friendly. I'm sorry, Barbara, you're on mute.
I'm having trouble today. Sorry, thank you so much, Cecile. Let me ask Lillian, what sort of, when you step back from the toolkit, what do you think needs to be built further, number one? And number two, what are the next steps? How do we begin to implement this in our own works?
Sure. So one of the things which we mentioned, I think that would be really helpful is to have data collection and data standards on inclusion of people with disabilities, because right now we just don't know what we don't know. So I think that's one major area that we're looking at. We've heard a lot about more information on how to do capacity assessments, which capacity assessments to do. That kind of whole process, I think, needs to be clearer and in as simplified communication as possible, as Cecile kind of mentioned before. I think that's another kind of phase. And as we mentioned in the toolkit, sort of considering how to enforce the ADA and in clinical research, sort of, what would that look like, and how could we kind of have a little bit more accountability there. So those are just a kind of few key things that we're kind of engaged with and thinking about and trying to work on a little bit more for the future.
Thank you. Cecile, did you want to add to that? What do you think our next steps are, and how should we be implementing what we've learned so far?
I completely agree with Willianne. One of the things that I thought through when I first came into role is, when we think about the dimensions of diversity and how broad that can be, how is that information currently being collected in our case report forms? What do they need to evolve to? And how do we make that, how do you then further take the information that you're collecting and analyze that in a meaningful sort of way? So just ensuring that we think through the entire continuum of not just designing diversity in mind, but also thinking about how that data is being collected and how it's being analyzed are some key areas where I think we need to add additional focus in order to ensure that we don't lose sight of the fact that designing is one thing, but you need to be able to collect the information and be able to make some meaningful recommendations based on the data at the end of the day.
Thank you. And one of the things that Willianne didn't point out in the toolkit is a tool specifically for thinking about outcome measures, which accommodates people with disabilities. So just to say, and doing things like allowing extra time and other measures is always incredibly important. So let me, I know we're almost out of time. Just wanted to say that in the comments, there have been some really wonderful reminders that informed consent need not be all written, that videos, audio communications, comic books, and visual imagery is very helpful. And we really have a lot to do with thinking about the range of, sort of methods of communication that we need to consider. With that, let me say, please take a minute to complete the survey before you end. It's actually 5 questions, and I think will be very, very helpful for us to understanding where we can be of further help. Please do let us know if you look at the toolkit, you see something that should be added, or of resources that should be added, or areas that have not been considered that should be. We'd love to hear from you. You can, in the toolkit, you'll see how to reach us, and we try to be responsive. And with that, let me send Duke our best wishes. Thanks, Cecile, enormously for not only participating today, but for all your work on behalf of the extended community. Willianne and I want to give a special mention to Juliet Philip, who has been really sort of an engine behind this work, and you've seen her on the chat. So thank you all. Continue to work with us, and thank you for joining. And thank you both.
Thank you.
And just as a reminder, before we say anything, we are still, of course, live.